Given John Cena is now a 17-time world champion, there's been a lot of discussion about those who have had many runs on top over the course of their career. That's right, whether it be Randy Orton or Triple H and their 14 spells each as champ, or even Ric Flair and his own 16 times at being the man, some of the best to ever do it have done it multiple times. But what about those on the opposite end of the spectrum? Those who have only held the gold once? Well, that's exactly who we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the Ultimate Warrior. Yes, well, it's easy to think that given how successful he was back during the late 80s and early 90s, the Ultimate Warrior must have had multiple runs as world champion in WWF. In truth, this only happened once. But then to be fair, that one time did happen on a pretty grand stage. What was this stage? Well, it was at WrestleMania 6, the show in which Warrior put a capper on his meteoric rise by beating Hulk Hogan in the main event to not only become WWF champion, but also to retain his Intercontinental title too. After that high, however, after that things would begin to take a downward trajectory for the new champ, as it quickly became apparent that he was not a draw on the same level as the Hulkster. So it was then that at the Royal Rumble in January of 1991, less than a year after he won the gold, the Indiana native would find himself dropping it to Sergeant Slaughter. But at least another run on top had to be on the cards following this, right? Not quite. And the reason for that was because for the rest of his career, the Warrior would consistently find himself butting heads with WWF management, something which led to him being fired on more than one occasion. Obviously then, with his appearances being so sporadic at that point, it didn't leave much opportunity to belt him up again. And even if there was a window of time where this would have been possible, it wasn't like Vince McMahon could trust Warrior to carry the top prize in the way he wanted him to anymore. So because of that, by the time the fan favorite parted ways with WWF once and for all in 1996, he'd remain a one-time champion. And that was a status which would remain for him regardless of where else he went in the subsequent years, as he never reached the mountaintop in places like WCW. No, there he would only stay for a cup of coffee, all before backstage issues saw him leave all over again. But the Ultimate Warrior isn't the only one-time world champion in WWE who ultimately lives in the shadow of Hulk Hogan. No, if we go a bit further back in time to the pre-Hulkamania era, we can actually see a very similar situation playing itself out with our next subject, superstar Billy Graham. Of course, in Billy Graham's case, however, it's not like he was overshadowed by Terry Bollea while he was active. No, that would only happen in retrospect. And the reason it would is because almost everything Hogan ever did was inspired by the superstar. The colorful clothes, the handlebar mustache, the 24-inch pythons, hell, even the heavy usage of the word brother in promos was inspired by Billy Graham. Needless to say then, all of these elements came together to make Graham a big star back during the Vince McMahon senior days of WWF. So big a deal would he be, in fact, he'd even managed to have a lengthy reign as world champion in 1977 and 1978, despite being a heel at the time. That's right, in a period where it was almost unheard of for a villain to have anything more than a transitional run with the gold, the superstar proved that you could not only do this, but also make business go up in the process. So why didn't the heel ever win the belt again after he dropped it to Bob Backlund on February 20th, 1978? Well, Vince McMahon Sr. just didn't see a babyface run in him, a run which would have allowed him to get another shot at the gold. Even when he left WWF and returned a few years later during the early 80s, by which point the company had rebranded as WWF, there was no pathway for Graham to regain the gold he'd once held, as this would be the period he started playing the role of a karate master, something no one was particularly fond of. And not long after that, he'd be gone forever, never returning to a WWF ring again while he was an active competitor. But even if he was only a one-time champion, it was still a hell of a run Billy Graham got to have, one which the influence of is still being felt to this day. And he's not the only person from the pre-Hulkamania era who was one and done when it comes to the WWE title. In fact, our next subject would do the same thing only a few years later, a man who went by the name of the Iron Chic. Now, we all remember Sheiky Baby, if not for his wrestling during the 70s and 80s, then at the very least for the bizarre and lovable public figure he became in his later years. That said, for as much as he was an icon of WWE, he'd only ever actually hold their top prize once. When did this happen? Well, it was on December 24th, 1983 that the Sheik, then playing the part of the foreign heel menace, challenged WWF champion Bob Backlund for the gold, and from there went on to beat him. Not that this would be a lengthy run for the Iranian though, rather it would only last for 28 days before he came up against a hurricane which went by the name of Hulkamania. and when that happened, the champ would lose in short order. Would he get other opportunities to win the title back following this? No. Once he'd done his job and dropped the big one, he'd be moved down the card almost immediately. But then, given the age he had reached by this point, that was probably to be expected. Hell, the only reason he was given the title at all in the mid-80s was because Vince McMahon needed a heel who he could use to transition between one babyface champion and another. So yes, it would only be a short one-and-done reign as the top dog when it came to the Iron Chic in WWE. But that would ultimately be enough to see him become a bit of a pop culture icon in the years which followed. But let's move away from the past and onto something closer to the present right now as our next subject, someone who first rose to prominence during the PG era, also only ever got one run with the WWE title. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Dean Ambrose. Sure, today he might go by the name of Jon Moxley, but before that, the Cincinnati native was working in the WWE as Dean Ambrose, and while he would have a very strong start there as 1/3 of the Shield alongside Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins, come 2016, there was definitely a sense that Dean had fallen behind that of his by then former stablemates. What he really needed then was something to kickstart him once more and get him back on that level that everyone knew he could be. And the first step towards this would happen when, at June 19th's Money in the Bank show that year, the Lunatic Fringe won the titular ladder match to earn a shot at the WWE title whenever he wanted. Obviously, though, few would have expected he'd go on to cash that title shot in before the evening was over. And that's why it came as such a surprise then when he ended Money in the Bank by holding the top prize in the company over his head. Would this be the start of a glorious age of Dean Ambrose being WWE's next top star? Not exactly. No, following this, he would find himself dropping the belt to AJ Styles just a few months later. And once he did this, he'd never win it again, largely because by the time early 2019 came around, he'd have left the company and instead gone over to become a member of the then upstart AEW roster. And while a Jon Moxley WWE return feels like a long shot in 2025, our next subject is always up for an occasional return. And as it happens, when it comes to Rob Van Dam, he's also a one and done when it comes to Reigns as WWE champion. Now with RVD, there could have been so many more runs on top for him if the company had chosen to pull the trigger a little earlier. Hell, as far back as when he first joined the roster in 2001 as part of the Invasion angle, he was easily one of the most over people on the show, right up there with the likes of Stone Cold Steve Austin and Kurt Angle. Really, with the exception of Booker T, he's maybe the only Alliance talent who came out of that whole situation looking great, and this would lead to fans spending years longing for him to reach the top of the mountain. But while fans might have wanted this, Vince McMahon wasn't necessarily of the same mind. And this is because Rob didn't exactly fit the mold of what he wanted in a champion. But eventually, Mr. Monday Night would wear his boss down because it was at One Night Stand in 2006 in that iconic venue of the Hammerstein Ballroom that ECW would have something of a homecoming when their guy beat John Cena to become WWE champion, all to a rapturous fan response. Sadly, though, any high the fans were experiencing following Van Dam's big victory would be cut short when only a few weeks later he'd be forced to drop not only this title, but also his ECW World title. Why was that? Well, because the champ would get busted for illegal substances in his car. So the decision was then made to have Rob drop all his gold and then from there serve a 30-day suspension. Obviously then, once RVD returned from the suspension, he'd be in the doghouse, and that meant he'd never again be trusted with holding the WWE title, no matter how over he remained with fans. But it's not always these types of issues which lead to someone never regaining the WWE title after they drop it. No, sometimes premature passing can be the unfortunate cause of this, as was the case with our next subject, Eddie Guerrero. Yes, if you were to list the best in-ring performers of all time, Latino Heat would be at the top of the list, but while this, combined with his superhuman levels of charisma, would see him be massively over with fans from day one in WWE, it wouldn't be enough to see him win the world title until well into his run. Of course, there was another reason why this didn't happen right away though, and that was because during the early 2000s, Eddie Guerrero was struggling a lot with his addictions. So bad was it, in fact, he'd at one point be fired from WWE and forced to go spend a spell on the indies as a king in exile of sorts, with all this eventually leading to him getting clean and being rehired by Vince McMahon once more in 2002. Even then, however, given his smaller size, the idea that Eddie could ever be WWE champion felt like a long shot for most fans, as they knew exactly how the boss liked to book and the type of people he liked to push. And this was why it came as such a pleasant surprise then when at No Way Out in February of 2004, he toppled Brock Lesnar to become the top dog on SmackDown in one of the greatest feel-good moments in wrestling history. Unfortunately though, when he lost the belt to JBL a few months later, Eddie would never regain it again. Hell, even when he'd reached a place where he was able to again, it wouldn't happen. And the reason for that was because it would be in November of 2005 that he'd tragically pass away at just 38 years old. But while he'd be gone at this point, Eddie Guerrero would certainly not be forgotten. In fact, even his one-and-done run as champion would be a tradition carried on with the man who succeeded him on top, the man we mentioned a moment ago, JBL. Yes, well, it might have taken JBL a while to reach top guy status in WWE, so long that it at one point looked like he was going to be cut from his contract. In fact, he would eventually reach such a level. So it might be surprising to learn then that when he did get there, he'd only ever hold the world title on one occasion. Sure, it was a significant reign, one which at the time was the longest in SmackDown's history. But even then, we imagine most would have assumed he got a second run at some point after the fact. So why didn't this happen? Well, there was just no need for it, really. No, after holding the WWE title for the better part of a year and then dropping it to John Cena, Bradshaw's work was done when it came to helping elevate the next generation. Really, where else could you go with him if he had a round two? We guess he could have played the hits again as a J.R. Ewing-esque king of the world, but with him getting older by the time the mid-2000s came around and a whole new batch of stars already waiting for their own moments in the sun, it just wasn't necessary. Even when JBL retired from in-ring competition in 2009, it didn't feel like there was anything being left on the table with regards to him. Rather, it felt very much like he'd overachieved, if anything. That's right, for a man who came so close to being released during the early 2000s, reaching the heights he did has to be considered a major win, even if it was only the one time he was able to ascend to the top of the mountain. But then the reality is you don't always have to be a multiple-time world champion in order to be considered great. That said, not everyone feels like they got everything they could out of their first world title reign in WWE, meaning there will always be a desire for them to get a second one at some point down the line. And if you need a prime example of this being the case, you need only look towards our next subject, Kevin Owens. Yes, Kevin Owens is quite simply one of the best in the world. A great wrestler, top-class promo, and a strong competitor for best all-rounder in the world today. Still though, with him not having the usual top guy look, many assumed he'd have a difficult time getting beyond the mid-card in a Vince McMahon-run company once he was called up to the main roster in 2015. But proving people wrong, KO was able to do just that when after inaugural Universal Champion Finn Balor was taken out by injury in the summer of 2016, it would be the Quebec native who got the tap on the shoulder to be the one to pick up the ball in his absence. How would Owens' run go after that? Very good, because his friendship and subsequent feud with Chris Jericho, which characterized much of his title reign, would be one of the best things we'd seen in years at that point. Sadly though, once this all climaxed in KO dropping the Universal title to Goldberg at Fastlane on March of 2017, he'd never again be able to reach the same heights. Why is this? It's hard to say. It's not as if the man formerly known as Kevin Steen isn't still a world-class performer, more than capable of being champion if he were given the opportunity. We guess his bosses just never felt the time was right in the years since. Of course, that could all change at any time though. In fact, before all is said and done, we could easily see Owens being a two-time world champion or more in WWE. But even if he doesn't do this, Kevin will remain one of the greats of his era and a dead cert for a future Hall of Fame slot. But what about our next subject? A man who was WWF champion back during the New Generation era. Who are we talking about here? Why, Diesel, of course. Yes, despite there being a time when Kevin Nash was the undisputed top dog in all of New York back during the mid-90s, he never actually got a chance to main event on the grandest stage of them all. And the reason for that was because when he was the champ in 1995, business was so bad that Vince McMahon felt the need to main event with Lawrence Taylor versus Bam Bam Bigelow instead, all in hopes that using a celebrity to close the show would grab some kind of mainstream attention. And by the time WrestleMania 12 came around a year later, Diesel would no longer be the champion, meaning he'd never get a second opportunity at headlining the big show. But that wasn't the only thing he never got a second opportunity at, because once he dropped the gold to Bret Hart in the winter of 1995, Big Sexy would not have a second run. Why was this? Well, as we said, business was not good for WWF back in the mid-90s. No, this was the period where things had gotten so dire, the company was at points on the verge of going out of business. So because he couldn't turn things around while he was the man, Kevin Nash would not be given a second bite at the apple afterwards. Sure, if he'd hung around for long enough, then this might have changed, but by the time 1996 rolled around, he was already gone from WWF, with this being the point both he and Scott Hall jumped to WCW in order to start the industry-changing NWO angle. And with him staying in WCW all the way up until they closed their doors in 2001, it meant he wouldn't be around in New York for what remained of his peak years. No, by the time he did return, it would be 2002, by which point he was no longer in his prime. As you would expect then, this was not the time to give Diesel a second run as WWE Champion. In fact, that time would never come again. But let's move away from Nash for now and head back over to the present day again, as it's there we find our next subject who was a one-and-done WWE Champion, the one, the only, Kofi Kingston. Yes, when Kofi Kingston won the WWE title at WrestleMania 35, it was one of the greatest feel-good moments we've seen in decades. And this was largely because of the fact that Kofi had been underutilized for so long. To see him finally go all the way to the top felt cathartic for those who followed his entire career. That said, for as great of a moment as it was when he toppled Daniel Bryan, it would all end in tears when a few months later, Kingston's run on top closed out with him getting squashed by Brock Lesnar on an episode of SmackDown. But at least he'd get another shot at winning the gold after this, right? Sadly, no, because once he dropped the title, Kofi would almost immediately return to being a tag team guy again. Clearly then, this is upsetting for his fans, as there was so much more to be done with Kofi Kingston as the guy, someone who could fill that underdog fan favorite role so many others had in the past. And that wouldn't be the only time a New Day member fell into main event obscurity after losing the WWE title to Brock Lesnar. No, the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, Big E. Yes, when like his fellow New Day stablemate Kofi Kingston, he finally got the nod to become WWE Champion after years of having toiled away in the mid-card, it felt like a moment which had been created specifically to make fans happy. And now that he was champ, these fans were there to support him as he spent the rest of the year representing Raw as its undisputed top dog. But then something happened, and that something was Brock Lesnar. That's right, at the Day 1 pay-per-view on January 1st, 2022, Big E would drop the titles to the Beast in a five-way bout, which also included Bobby Lashley, Kevin Owens, and Seth Rollins. And once he lost the gold, Big E would never regain it. And part of the reason for this is because in March of that year, he'd suffer a catastrophic neck injury that would see him be put on the shelf. And it's on the shelf he remains as of 2025, with it currently looking unlikely that he'll ever be cleared to wrestle again anytime soon. Obviously then, this means no more world title runs. But what about our next subject, someone who, like with superstar Billy Graham and the Iron Chic, came from the pre-Hulkamania days, and who there had one and only one run with the WWF title. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Pedro Morales. Of course, what separates Pedro Morales from both superstar Billy Graham and the Iron Sheik is that, well, they were both, to differing degrees, transitional champions designed to keep the belt warm for the next babyface superstar and Bob Backlund and Hulk Hogan respectively. Pedro was, for a little while at least, the next babyface superstar. That's right, after Bruno Sammartino's first legendary reign as top dog in WWF came to an end in 1971, it would be the Puerto Rican who was chosen to replace him. And he'd certainly do a great job of this, as for 1,027 days thereafter, he'd stand tall as the man in Vince McMahon Sr.'s promotion, with this making him the fifth longest reigning champion in WWE history, behind only Bruno, Bob Backlund, Hulk Hogan, and Roman Reigns. So why is it that Morales never got another run on top once his time came to an end? Well, back in those days, it was pretty rare for that kind of thing to happen. Hell, even Bob Backlund, arguably a bigger star during the WWF days, only held the gold once in that time period. Yes, lengthy reigns were the order of the day during the 70s. And when those reigns were over, it was usually on to the next top star, as there was no need for a second given how long the first had probably lasted. And that's exactly why it would be well-deserved when he was entered into the company's Hall of Fame in 1995. But then everyone we've looked at today, if not already in that Hall of Fame, will probably be there one day because they each excelled as a one-time champion in WWE.